Hello and welcome to another Josh Plays 40k painting tutorial. Today we'll be painting up some spirit hosts from the Nighthaunt army in the Age of Sigmar range. I've taken a little bit of a different step and actually decided to paint all three of them on camera rather than just showing you how to do one, mostly because they are slightly different in their own way, so the shapes and styles of the models, and then they all have these sort of intricate little sort of base decorations, so it's just quite nice to see how they're painted up slightly differently as well. Plus we're also going to show a couple of different methods with the ethereal green, depending on how long you've been in the hobby for and what sort of paint ranges you have available to you. All Citadel, but using an older style paint from the glazing range, which obviously now sadly no longer is in existence, because obviously a lot of that has now been taken over by contrast. So we're going to kick things off by blocking in some of the smaller details, and then we will end things with the ethereal effect, because that is the majority of the models, and it's much easier to tidy up the white than trying to come in first of all with the ethereal and then tidying it up later on. So without further ado, let's get started. So as you see here, we have primed all three of the miniatures in white scar undercoat. This just gives us a really nice sort of base coat to work from, and obviously with regards to the ethereal effect later on, we want this to be slightly more white underneath, so starting with something like Grey Seer or Wraithbone would actually be one too sort of stark and again too warm on the other side, so a nice sort of neutral colour of white is where I'd recommend starting. But what we're going to start off with underneath is the bones and any skulls on the bases, and for this we're going to be using Skeleton Horde contrast paint, and this is just straight from the pot, and I am using a small base brush for this just to maintain the control, but effectively we are just going to sort of liberally apply this over any skeleton parts or skulls that are on the miniatures themselves, and try not to get this obviously on any of the ethereal effects. Don't worry so much if you get it on the stones underneath, as we will be using a different colour for those shortly, and that is actually a standard base paint rather than a contrast, so you don't need to worry so much about where that goes. But take your time, work your way around all three of the bases. As I say, they all have skeletons as their primary sort of stand off the base, which is obviously where the spirits are coming from. So next up, sticking with the Skeleton Horde, and it's really only then applying it to this particular base feature here, is we're going to thin Skeleton Horde 1:1 with some contrast medium, just to take the complete darkness away from it, and this is just to go over the candles, so obviously the wax falling down and over that, so you can apply that quite liberally over all of the top, and then let that completely dry before we move on to the next step. But this will just help. It will look slightly different to the skull on the side, but also giving that sort of classic sort of orangey brown wax feel. Once you're happy with that Skeleton Horde, we're going to move on to Mechanicus Standard Grey, and this is for all the rocks and plinths and stones around the miniatures. So particularly any of the rocks around the skeletons at the bottom, here on this one, the sort of gravestone like obviously statuette around there, including the sort of rocks around its base. Now particularly with regards to this one, when applying this on, go quite steady around the sort of fire emblem here, as we will be painting this a different colour, so we're trying to sort of map and mark out the edges with the Mechanicus Standard Grey, and you, instead of going all the way over it, just to save yourself with the neatening up later on. It's quite an easy emblem to trace around, so hopefully you won't have too many issues. And similarly on this one, on this gravestone as well, there is a sort of plant, sort of rose plant growing around it, so again just sort of take your time to trace around the edges of that. Again, just saving yourself a bit of time. I mean, this will be this isn't being painted over with a contrast, so it's not as important if you do touch it, but it just saves you having to coat over as many times if you don't catch too much. So just take your time to work your way around all those rocks. This will probably be one of the most time consuming aspects of the painting, just because there is quite a lot of rock features and stone features on the miniature, but once it is done, it does start to really break the colours up and get the models looking quite nice. So again, just take your time and work your way around. Once you're happy with that Mechanicus Standard Grey, we're then going to get a little bit of Warpstone Glow, and this is to pick out the green vines on this particular model's sort of base feature, and it's the only one that has it, but you just want to carefully go over the top of those vines as they wrap around this gravestone, just being careful not to go on the Mechanicus Standard Grey. But if you do get anything on there, just literally just neaten back up with the grey afterwards, and then move on. But I'm using a small layer brush just to maintain control, but you can use a slightly bigger brush if you're not worried about having to tidy up afterwards. But just carefully coat that over. Depending on how sort of heavy you put this on, you may find you'll need a second coat, but otherwise we'll move on to the next step. And then next up, sticking with that floral decoration, we're going to get a little bit of Screamer Pink, and this is to pick out the roses within that. So again, just sticking with the smaller layer brush, we can just carefully pick out those flowers. Moving over to the fire emblem on this particular miniature, we're going to take some iron yellow contrast, and we're just going to carefully apply this. Again, I'm sticking with the smaller layer brush over the top of that emblem, just to obviously give that more definition. Next up, we're going to move on to some lead belcher, and this is to pick out all of the knives and daggers that these miniatures have. So you just have to carefully pick them out one by one, but this particular basing here, the spirit on the left here has two, and then you've got the one in the middle that has one sticking down, and they sort of all range a little bit. So they're particularly with this one here, for instance, there's only two with daggers, so this one here and down here, and the other one being the same. So just work your way around. Again, I'm sticking with a smaller brush just to maintain the control. Obviously, if you do make any mistakes, we can go back at the end, which we will do with some white scar, just to tidy up any mistakes before we move on to the ethereal effect. But otherwise, just to obviously coat that over the top. Now, we won't necessarily need two coats of this, as we are going to shade it, but the primary thing that we are going to do is when we get to a certain stage of the ethereal effect, we will be including the knives and daggers in that highlight, so that they look less metallic and slightly more sort of see-through and mystical, as if a spirit obviously was holding them and had conjured them. But for the time being, we do still want them to show as if they are metal and sharp. Once you're happy with that lead belcher, we're going to move on to do a couple of shades. Now, the first one we're going to do here is some Nun Oil, and this is just over the top of that lead belcher that we have just painted. Now, you don't want to go on too heavy with this. This is just literally just to give that metal a little bit of definition on top of the normal lead belcher, just to help pick out any sort of curves and raised edges of the blades. The second shade we're going to do is some Agrax Earth Shade, and this is over all of these stone areas that we've already done with the Mechanicus Standard Grey. Now, particularly do take care not to go over the fire emblem or the sort of skeleton parts that we've already done. With regards to the skeleton parts, that is slightly less important, because obviously it will only intensify the sort of brown, but we don't really want it to go over the top of the yellow, as obviously that will take the sort of effect away from what we were going for. When we get to the rose and sort of plant vine on the other one, what you'd want to do is ensure that you cover over that as well, just to give the rose and vine some definition as well. So as I was just saying, when you come to this particular piece, the shade can go all over everything. It will also help tie it all into the model, make it look as though it's all been there quite a while. Once you've got those shades dry, what you're going to want to then do is tidy up any of the white where the shades or other colours have touched that. And once you've done that and it's dry, we're then going to do a little highlight of Emperor's Children, and this is just to pick out some of the details of the roses on this particular plinth here. We're just going to sort of gently highlight around the edges of those. They are quite small, so I would recommend a smaller brush. I'm using the small layer brush, but you can use smaller if you have it, just to maintain the detail. But effectively what we're trying to do here is just pick out the edges and outline the leaves of the roses. So moving on to the ethereal effect next. As I said at the beginning of the video, there's a couple of different ways that we're going to look at that depending on what paint you have in your arsenal. Now the first one we're going to try is the more traditional method for how I've been painting these up for my army, and this is just simply because I was lucky enough to have a pot of this, as I say, on the shelf. But I know it has now been discontinued, and that is the glaze paint Waywatcher Green. And this is a really nice thinned green subtle shading, as I say, used typically for altering the hue of another colour, but in this particular instance actually starts us off with a really thin green shade, especially over the top of white. And you can use this straight from the pot if you have it. If you don't, then as I say, please skip forward to the next step, and I will show you another method of doing this. So effectively, as I say, you don't want to put it on too heavy, but you do want to make sure that it gets all over the obviously the wraith and the ghost parts of the model. Do not panic if it gets over anything else, i.e. the weapon. Try not to get it over the skeleton horde because that will show, but if it does touch it, it isn't a massive problem. When we get to the last step after applying these greens, that will most likely cover that up. But we're not looking for any significant pooling or anything like that, really just looking to get a nice smooth coverage over the top of that green. So the next method of painting the ethereal effect, we're going to be using the Hexwraith Flame, thinned down with some Lamia Medium. This is a 2-to-1 mix of Lamia Medium to Hexwraith Flame. So it's nice and thin, nice and easy to move, and we are going to then apply this in a similar way as before, just all over the white. It will have a slightly different, ever so slightly different hue to the Waywatcher Green, but it's still a really good sort of ghostly ethereal effect. Now using sort of Hexwraith Flame on its own, it is a little bit thicker. Obviously it's now part of the contrast range rather than a technical paint, but obviously it is designed to leave a more opaque finish, but obviously what we want to try and do here is still have some of that white undercoat sort of shining through, giving that sort of more ghostly appeal. So again, just sort of pop it through all over the white, obviously take your time, and I'm going to do this over the next 2 miniatures, so that we've got 2 in this particular style for you to see. Once you've let those shades dry, you'll notice obviously between the two there is a subtle difference between what is the glaze and the contrast paint of Hexwraith Flame. It's just that the glaze is slightly more intense with its colour, but in all honesty it won't make much difference after we now apply the Drybrush. So depending on which way you want to go, naturally I assume if you start with one, you'll continue for the rest of your army. So what we're going to do next is a Drybrush of Ethereal Grey, and this is quite a light Drybrush, just over the entire miniature really. Now These are quite rickety, as I'm sure you found out from building and painting them so far, so I would recommend bracing whichever part you are dry brushing at the time with your finger, just to be sure. And this is to go over not only just the green, but also the weapons, as we'll be looking to give them a slightly more sort of ghosted effect than what they are now, and just take the intensity of that silver away, but also over the rocks at the bottom, and very lightly over the gravestones as well, just to give them a little bit of a highlight. And you can do the skeleton horde if you wish, however you don't necessarily have to. So work your way around each of your wraiths, and we'll soon come back and see how they're looking at the end. Once you're happy with that dry brush, the painting is now all finished for these models, and as you can see, the difference between the two styles, I'm not sure if the camera completely picks it up, but with the dry brush added on, you can barely see the difference between the two different painting styles and techniques that we've used here. And obviously, depending on what paints you've got available to you, is the technique that you can go for. I'm obviously always open to different ways of doing an ethereal effect, or if there are other brands of paint out there that people prefer, please just let me know in the comments below. But otherwise, these are ready to be based up. I quite personally prefer the sort of dirty graveyard theme with the sort of snow onto it, very traditional to the artwork that you see for Nighthaunt, but I think it really does work quite nicely for these models. So I'm now going to get these based up. And here we have all the finished Nighthaunt Spirit Hosts all ready to go onto the battlefield. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Leave a like and a comment below if you have any questions, and subscribe to the channel for more content to come. Thank you.